welcome our moderator for today, Andy Sharp.
Good evening. I'm Andy Sharp. I'm Nikkei Asia's politics and economy news editor. Welcome to our special webinar on what promises to be a hugely significant G7 summit. We are broadcasting live from the Western Japanese city of Hiroshima, a place known around the world for the August 6, 1945 US atomic bombing, an event that still resonates throughout the city, the country, and beyond. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida chose to host the summit here for several reasons. Perhaps the biggest one is that his family hails from Hiroshima and his parliamentary seat is here. But events such as the Ukraine war and Kishida's stated life work to rid the world of nuclear weapons were also a big factor in the decision. The city is abuzz with the summit, with restaurants offering local versions of the local speciality, okonomiyaki, based on the cuisines of the member nations. And security is extremely tight. There's police on every corner. Perhaps this is due to the assassination last year of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the attempt on Kishida's life just a couple of months ago. So joining the 7 nations and the European Union in Hiroshima will be several significant Asian nations, notably India, Indonesia, South Korea, Vietnam, and Australia. The talks here over the next few days are likely to be dominated by the Ukraine war, the growing dominance of China, and the threat to Taiwan. Related to this are issues surrounding supply chains and economic and energy security. Plus, the attendance of India, a country that chairs the G20 this year, is likely to shine a spotlight on the so-called global south. Joining me today, 3 of my colleagues, in no particular order. There's Ken Moriyasu. He's our diplomatic correspondent based in Tokyo. There's Loli Lee. She's actually calling in from Taipei, where she's our technology correspondent. And Kiran Sharma, who's flown in from New Delhi to Hiroshima. She's our India correspondent. So without any further ado, we'll go to our panelists. So let's look back at previous G7s in Japan. Maybe ask this one to Ken. Have the G7s here produced any significant results in the past?
Yeah, I want to go back to 1979 when the first G7 was held in Japan. 44 years ago, this summit was held at the Akasaka Guest House. The prime minister back then was Masayoshi Ohira, who died the following year. The US president was Jimmy Carter, and Margaret Thatcher had just become the British prime minister 2 months before the summit. The 1979 Tokyo summit came at a time when oil was the dominant topic. The Iranian Revolution had taken place earlier that year, and the new Islamic rulers expelled the oil majors from the country and nationalized oil production. So Iran back then was the world's 2nd largest oil producer, and their actions triggered a spike in oil prices and created a significant shortage of oil. If you look at the 1979 communique, the word oil appears 32 times. And interestingly, the word China appears 0 times. What they did back then is to agree on collective action in 1979. Each country pledged to reduce oil consumption compared to the years before. So it was very much looks different from today.
Indeed. And Ken, this summit here in Hiroshima over the next few days, is there going to be some kind of similar collective response to today's problems? Well, the many problems we face in the world today.
So I do believe that the Hiroshima summit will go down in history as a pivotal turning point when the G7 made clear in unequivocal terms that maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is not a Chinese domestic issue, but an international concern. Taiwan was first mentioned in the G7 summit 2 summits ago in 2021 in Cornwall, where the leaders said, and I quote, "We underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait." It was Japan that pushed for this statement to be put in the G7 summit, I hear. And one of the officials told me that it was a little noticed, but a major achievement for Japanese diplomacy. This time, they will add one more line to this, and they will say that in addition to underscoring the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, they will likely say that peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is an indispensable element for the security and prosperity of the international community. So really underscoring that this is not a Chinese domestic issue, and that if China does militarily invade Taiwan, the world's leading nations will not consider it a Chinese domestic issue, but a matter that concerns the wider international community.
Interesting. So why is Japan pushing the G7 to mention Taiwan?
Right. For the longest time, Japan did not consider China as an adversary. Tokyo thought that maintaining friendly relations with Beijing would lead to peace. But Japanese leaders have come to realize that this is probably not the case. Japan has recently concluded that China is intent on creating a new world order that fits its style. That new order will look very differently from the order that we live in today. It's not about freedom. It's not about democracy. It's not about the rule of law, but more an order that is more comfortable for the Chinese Communist Party. And it could boil down to the very common phrase of might is right. Japan prefers to live in the current order, which is free, open, predictable, rules-based, and stable. It's important to note that Japan is not entirely comfortable with the Biden administration's categorization of democracies versus autocracies, because Japan feels that that would alienate countries like Vietnam or Turkey, although Turkey had a very democratic election this time. Japan instead sees a dividing line between those countries who want to protect the existing international order and those who feel that the current system is unfair and want to create a new order, namely China and Russia. Now, but while all that sounds good on paper, there are hiccups along the way. Very symbolically today, US President Joe Biden announced that he will not be traveling to Papua New Guinea to beat the island nations of the South Pacific and not travel to Australia for the Quad Leader Summit because he has to handle domestic issues, namely the debt ceiling. And Australia has cancelled the Quad itself, which is a terrible setback for the Western Alliance.
Yeah, I was really surprised by that news today. It's kind of unprecedented for such a major meeting to be cancelled. But just going back to Taiwan, maybe I can go to Lawley, because of course the whole world is talking about Taiwan. Many framing it as a pivotal part between the US on one side and China on the other. But it's an actual place with 20 odd million people living there, a huge tech industry. So what do people living in Taiwan think about the issues surrounding the island? How's it being viewed there, this kind of war of words right now? How's it being viewed there by the government? And also, what's your own personal view? What do people like you and your peers think about this?
Yeah, sure. But to be completely honest with you, the local media coverage in Taiwan in the past several days, especially today, is all about the opposition party KMT's presidential nomination, which this afternoon KMT just decided to pick new Taipei City Mayor Hou You-yi to challenge the China skeptic DPP's Vice President William Lai. But of course, there are coverages and attention about the G7 summit in Taiwan. The politicians, the DPP government, and the general public in Taiwan really care about whether the summit will bring up the safety of the Taiwan Strait under the more and more aggressive Chinese pressure, which the democratic rule island endures the threats of Chinese military jets almost on a daily basis. And for myself, the other day I was chatting with my college friends who are not working in the media industry, and even ordinary people like my friends. They hope such safety issues surrounding Taiwan can be brought up more often in important international events like the G7 summit in Japan.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it certainly will be a very interesting election in January. It's going to be very hard to call, and there'll be a lot of focus on the winner of this. So yeah, we look forward to writing about that in the next few months. So to kid on, actually, so we talked about Taiwan, but India as one of the guests here in Hiroshima, it does appear to be playing both sides, playing the US on one hand, but also, kind of backing China and Russia in some other ways. It's kind of going to both summits and meetings with both these two sides of the world global order. Seems to be playing its hand rather well. Could you shed some light, please, on what you think Modi will be trying to achieve in Hiroshima?
Thank you, Andy. Prime Minister Modi is going to Hiroshima to attend the G7 summit as a special invitee. And his presence at the G7 summits has become a kind of a recurring feature since 2019. And it is because of the kind of importance G7 places on India's leadership, as also because of the fact that Prime Minister Modi has developed an excellent rapport with the world leaders. And now when Prime Minister Modi goes there, he would definitely be amplifying the voice of the global south, the pressing issues of fuel, food and fertilizer crisis, and the debt burdens of the developing countries, and would be looking forward to the response from the developed countries, how these crises can be resolved.
I see. Thank you. Okay, let's switch now to the incredibly important subject of how global events have been affecting supply chains and economic and energy security. This is something the whole world seems to be feeling right now. And there's no better person to talk about this than Loli Lee. She regularly breaks news on the tech supply chain for us from Taiwan. So can you just give us a kind of overview, please, Loli, of the recent issues with supply chain security?
Yeah, of course. The topic of supply chain security has never been highlighted this much. In recent years, the US, to be more specific, the Donald Trump administration called on the restructuring of the supply chain and the vulnerability of over-reliance on manufacturing in China during the trade war. And other countries actually gained the awareness of the supply chain security after the outbreak of the coronavirus. The unprecedented chips and component shortages really exposed the vulnerabilities of the supply chain. And that's when more and more people realize the importance of the tiny little chips in all kinds of devices. Because without these tiny chips, a smartphone can't be assembled, a PC can't be made, a car can't be produced, and the production continuity of weapons will be at risk. And the Ukraine war further deteriorated the supply chain disruptions. So we are seeing one country after the other, many major economies, including the G7 members and the invitees of the summit, like India, all called on building a more resilient supply chain. And countries like the US, Japan, South Korea, and EU, and India all passed their own versions of the CHIPS Act, trying to subsidize their own supply chain.
Interesting. So this is obviously what the governments are doing. What about the companies, the big tech companies around the world? What are they doing in response to the call from governments for more diversification of the supply chain?
Yeah, the tech supply chain is addressing the calls from the governments. We are seeing the world's biggest contract chip maker, TSMC, which is now building chip factories in the US, in Japan, and it is considering to build its first plant in Europe, which is departing the company's decades-long strategy to build chip factories in Taiwan. And in fact, TSMC just confirmed a Nikkei report earlier today that its chairman, Mark Liu, will meet Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida tomorrow, along with the executives from other chip makers like Intel and Macron to talk about their investments in Japan. And I would like to talk a little bit more about the final product assembly sector, which is also diversifying away from China. For example, Apple is asking Foxconn to build more iPhones in India, asking assemblers to make AirPods, MacBooks, iPads in Vietnam. And American PC maker Dell also asked its suppliers to move some of the notebook assembly capacity away from China. What I want to say is that over these years, my colleague Annie Chen Fang, who excellently covers semiconductors, and we together interviewed countless tech suppliers across the entire sector. And the common ground we got is that most of the tech suppliers agree geopolitics is reshaping the landscape of the supply chain, from centering in a particular country to regional manufacturing. And this mega trend of supply chain diversification is going to stay here for a very long time.
I see. So going back to what might come out of the summit, Ken, what might the G7 members say about supply chains in its concluding statement, and what kind of impact do you think that might have?
Right. I changed my microphone. Do you hear me better now?
You're loud and clear for me, Ken.
All right. So the G7 statement will probably say that threats to economic security are increasing, and that the G7 shares the view that supply chains should be built in a, quote, transparent, diversified, secure, sustainable, trustworthy, and reliable manner. They will talk about the need to build more resilient and sustainable supply chains for critical minerals, food, fertilizer, and energy.
I see. Thank you, Ken. And Kiran, how do these supply chain issues and the issue of economic security, how does it affect India? How does it affect the so-called global South?
India, ever since the onset of the COVID pandemic, and when the world started looking at new options, to move away from China when it comes to the issue of supply chain, India has been projecting itself, as a manufacturing hub, and the world can look at India where it can provide better technology and other options which China is offering right now. But at the same time, Prime Minister Modi is calling for a resilient infrastructure and trying to, ask the world leaders to come to the table with options where, India can provide something in this regard. And I think he has been doing a pretty good job on this front, and has been telling the world that, these are the things India can provide to you, and also how India can collaborate with other countries in this regard and resolve the issue of the supply chain being faced by the world after the COVID, as well as after the Russian war in Ukraine.
I see. So yeah, let's see what happens with the other countries that are coming to Hiroshima. Just to recap here. So as well as India, we have Brazil, we have Comoros, the current chair of the African Union, Indonesia, which is the chair of ASEAN this year, Vietnam, Australia, and the Cook Islands, the Pacific Islands Forum chair. Oh, and not forgetting South Korea, of course. There should be a very interesting summit between Yoon, Kishida, and possibly Biden. We'll have to see about that. But anyway, go back to India. Why do you think, Kiran, that Modi has become such a fixture at G7s in recent years?
Yes, Andy, you're right that Prime Minister Modi has become a kind of fixture at G7 summits in recent years. In fact, ever since his appearance at the meet in 2019 in France, he has been continuously invited to be an attendee at these summits. So in 2020 also, when it was to be held in Camp David, that time the then US President Donald Trump invited him for the planned meet, which was eventually cancelled. And in 2021, he was invited by the UK to participate in it, and he had to address it virtually because of the devastating second wave of pandemic in India. He could not travel, but did address it virtually. And then last year, he was there in Germany to attend the meet. This time in Hiroshima, it is the 5th successive invitation to Prime Minister Modi. And this reflects the importance the G7 places on India, and also recognition of the fact that the major global challenges cannot be resolved without New Delhi's participation. At the same time, if you go by the trend, it seems that Modi, or if Modi comes to the power again next year after the general election, he would be invited for the G7 meet. And India in general definitely would be invited. But it is in sharp contrast to how G7 is treating Russia and China, who would probably never be invited to these meets because of the current ongoing war in Ukraine, and also because of the no limits partnership that China has struck with Russia. So obviously New Delhi is rising on the global stage.
Certainly does seem to be. I mean, Modi does seem to be becoming a permanent fixture at these global G7 meetings. So this year, I mean, what's the significance of his attendance, do you think, Kiran?
Yeah, this time Prime Minister Modi's presence at the summit is even more special because it comes at a time when India is holding the presidency of G20, a forum which it has extensively used this year to promote interest of the so-called global South countries, as the less developed world looks up to New Delhi to speak on its behalf. From the very start of its G20 presidency, India made it clear that it is going to focus on the pressing issues such as fuel, food, and fertilizer crisis, which are the knock-on effects of Russia's war in Ukraine, as well as debt burdens of developing countries. It kicked off the year with the inaugural Voice of Global South Summit, drawing 125 countries. And during the summit, it heard their concerns and later said the unique meet highlighted the need to reform international bodies for a more balanced representation. At the Hiroshima summit also, Prime Minister Modi is expected to speak about the issues of the global South and seek the developed world's feedback on how challenges of food and energy security, debt, climate change and environment, and conflict zones could be resolved for peace, prosperity, and stability of a sustainable planet.
I see. So I wonder how the core G7 members will respond to Modi's push for these things. Ken, what do you think they will say?
Right. Before we go to that, the global South, I just found it really interesting how Modi has been invited for 5 consecutive G7s, and as Kiran says, if he's elected again, he'll continue to be invited. I don't see any G7 host country not inviting India or Australia or South Korea for that matter. So that means the G7 is no longer the G7, it's basically a G10. And if you add Indonesia and Brazil, it's probably a G12. And that's the kind of base grouping that would be at the core of world decision making. It's also important to note that the G20 is not functioning anymore because China and Russia are in it. If you go back, the G20 was built after the 2008 financial crisis, saying that we are heading to a multipolar world and we cannot just leave the West to decide things, because the financial crisis was an example of what happens when only a bunch of people make the decisions. That era is also coming to an end. The G20, I don't think, will function very effectively. So the cancellation of the G7, the cancellation of the G20, and the emergence of the G12, I think, would be one of the topics of this year. Now, going back to the global South, Kishida is trying to push this narrative of, like, we need to defend the international order. We need a coalition of like-minded countries to prevent China and Russia from creating a new might is right world order. And if that's the strategy, it's crucial to get the global South on board. And I think that will be the focus going forward.
Okay, thank you, Ken. So I'm going to ask each of you now, just quickly, to name the one thing that you are the most interested in at this summit. Perhaps we could start with Loli.
Sure. Definitely the detailed discussions about the supply chain security. I mean, yes, we are seeing like some chip makers or product assemblers like TSMC and Foxconn. Yes, they're moving away their capacity from the places they usually have. But there are so many challenges ahead. For example, like a new government's subsidy continuity and how to build an ecosystem of the supply chain and how to find enough talents to build a new supply chain because we are talking about a very long and complicated supply chain. For example, just take the chip sector, for example. To have a semiconductor supply chain, it's not just about asking chip makers like TSMC to build a chip fab in your country. You have to think about the readiness of water, electricity, special chemical supplies, specialty gas supplies, the equipment, the engineers, all the ecosystem. They say that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, I think it takes a country to build a semiconductor supply chain, for example. So I think there are a lot of challenges ahead, apart from just, allocating one-time subsidy. It's not enough to have a sustainable new supply chain. You will be very interested to know if the G7 summit actually discuss some detailed conversations about how to execute and how to friendshoring the supply chain. Yeah, that would be the most interesting part for me to learn more about the summit discussion.
Thanks, Oli. I can see your passion there for supply chains.
Yes.
Ken, as our diplomatic correspondent, what will you be looking out for?
Right, so I'm going to try to be passionate about diplomacy as well. So I'll be watching Emmanuel Macron. Macron, of course, raised eyebrows by going to China and receiving a red carpet treatment in Beijing. He also told political Europe dependency on the US and avoid getting dragged into a confrontation between China and the US over Taiwan. People got all worked up on whether Macron was soft on China, but I think the key thing here is maybe not his views on China, but how France sees the US-led efforts in the Indo-Pacific. Interestingly, this morning I interviewed the foreign minister of Lithuania, who has been under tremendous economic coercion from China, from opening a Taiwan office in its country. But he told me, the Lithuanian foreign minister told me that when Lithuania was suffering from Chinese coercion, France was one of the most helpful countries in offering goods and aid. And I think that kind of tells us that Macron's stance cannot be simply painted as pro-China. But he does definitely seem to have an unease about this Biden-led effort in the Indo-Pacific, especially dividing countries between democracies and autocracies. And I thought, as Japan tries to keep France on board in this building a coalition of like-minded nations to defend the current international order, I think it's really important to not get that wrong. What Macron is trying to do, is he trying to be soft on China, or is he trying to put a pause on this Biden-led effort in the Indo-Pacific? And I think it's the latter. And if that's the case, if Japan tries to preach France about how bad China is, to bring France to its side, I think it's the wrong strategy. I think Japan has to understand where France feels uncomfortable and try to find a way to both satisfy France's concerns, but also in the bigger picture, bring it on board to this effort to build a coalition to defend the current international order. Thank you.
Yes, interesting. I'm sure that Macron will be one of the most heavily covered leaders in Hiroshima. It's going to be very interesting to see what he says and does at the summit. Okay, last but not least, Kiran, what are you looking out for? What's the one thing that is the most important for you at this summit?
Yeah, while these formats such as the G7 and G20, if one goes by the history or trends, they are not known to bring to tables concrete outcomes, but actually joint statements delineate the broader objectives and their long-term goals. Nevertheless, I would be interested in watching whether they have anything to say about the debt burdens of developing countries, because this seems to be one of the issues on which all the countries come to the common ground. And whether they come out with any policy framework or anything else to say on this pressing issue the countries in the global south are facing. So definitely I would be looking at what they say about the debt issue. Thank you.
Hey, definitely be very interesting to see what they come up with there. Okay, so we've got a lot of questions from our viewers, which I'm more than very, very happy to receive. So yeah, please, as we said before, please send them in the chat function or through the other means. Let me just go through some of these questions. Some of them have people's names in them, some of them are anonymous, so I'll treat them as such. The first question, I think I'll ask Ken. It seems very likely that there could be a trilateral summit between the US, Japan, and South Korea in Hiroshima. Obviously, Japan and South Korea have come a lot closer over the last few months, with Yoon reaching out with an olive branch to Japan. And of course, the US is very happy to see these two of its allies coming closer, certainly with a powerful China next door to them. What do you think will come out of this potential trilateral summit, Ken?
Yeah, so South Korea's shift of foreign policy is probably, without doubt, the biggest change in the Indo-Pacific in the last few years. And I think it comes from an understanding that China cannot be depended upon to implement South Korea's North Korea policy. Of course, North Korea is South Korea's #1 topic, foreign policy challenge. And if that's the case, China is not an enemy, but a partner, because China has so much leverage of North Korea. That's why South Korea has always been hesitant to have a bad relationship with China. But I think it's realized that China is really not doing much in that regard. And also this continuing to try to balance between the Western alliance and China not taking sides is going to increasingly isolate South Korea. And if South Korea really wants to go down this path, the only way it can do that is to become the Israel of Far East Asia. That would be to have nuclear weapons of its own and use 20% of its GDP on defense. So if they're willing to do that, they can have this very autonomous foreign policy, but that's probably not doable. So Yoon Suk-yeol has made a very strategic decision to be with the West. And to be with the West, he had to mend relations with Japan. So he took a very courageous decision to come to Japan, and Kishida has embraced that effort. There is a lot of hesitation in Japan, thinking that this good relation might last while Yoon Suk-yeol is in office, but the minute the next administration comes into office, everything could be torn apart. That is true, it has happened before, but there is really not much alternative than to accept Yoon Suk-yeol's reapproachment. So I think that's the big picture. Now, many diplomats recently have told me that while all eyes are on Taiwan, North Korea could be even more imminent and dangerous for the region. And there is a tendency in the Biden administration to ignore the North Korean issue because his predecessor, Donald Trump, tried to reach out to Kim Jong-un. And the Biden administration is very keen on portraying that as a terrible failure, and that dealing with North Korea will produce nothing. So they have really chosen to ignore the North Korean file. but that could be dangerous, and it'll be interesting to see if there is any more, especially if Yoon Suk-yeol convinces Biden and Kishida to focus more on the North Korean issue.
Interesting, yeah. Okay, next question I think will go, it's another anonymous one, goes to Kiran, please. How should G7 countries cooperate with the Global South going forward to reduce their dependence on China and other places, such as Russia, for example?
Right. The countries in Global South, they definitely look toward the Global North, the developed world, for resources, because the political power, capital, and technology rests with the most advanced countries in the world. So unless these countries really support the less developed world in terms of providing resources, even climate finance for that matter, these countries can't really progress. So they all are looking forward to the Global North to help them, the G7 to help them when it comes to meeting the challenges of the food security, energy security, as well as the climate finance. So the political power, the capital, and the technology still is lying with the North.
Okay, thank you. And next question is, I think obviously for Lolly, it directly mentions TSMC. So where does this all go from here? How do these growing geopolitical tensions impact the strategies of companies such as TSMC in places such as the US, China, and Japan?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, the tech suppliers that we've been talked to all said that today geopolitics is a crucial factor in business decisions, especially in the semiconductor industry, because there are so many national security implications in these tiny chips that can empower from consumer electronics like smartphones all the way to like F-35 fighter jets. So of course, countries like the US might be the most aggressive ones trying to rebuild its semiconductor supply chain. And it has been successfully lured like chip makers like TSMC, Samsung, and also, of course, including its own Intel to build more capacity in the US. And TSMC in December last year just announced that it will invest more in the Arizona plant while its first phase of the chip fab is still under construction. But as I mentioned earlier, there are still challenges ahead. It's not just about offering subsidies to these kind of companies. There are still a lot of links and choke points in this supply chain that the governments needs to think about. It's not just about inviting one chip maker and you are done. No, it's far more than that. And above all, the most challenging part for this year and going forward might be the global economic downturn. Although we haven't seen any of the major chip makers like scaling back their capital expenditure for this year, but they are all lowering their revenue target for this year already. And this is a warning for all the governments to be aware of, that this continued economic downturn might drag their ambition to rebuild their own semiconductor supply chain. And I think that's a really important factor to be considered about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lolly. Yeah, this meeting tomorrow will be interesting in Tokyo with Kishida meeting the executives of all these big chip makers around the world.
Yes.
Quite unprecedented, I think, to have such a meeting. So that would be something to be watching very closely for. So going on next, going back to the Ukraine war, it does seem like sanctions against Russia are just not working, with Russia making higher sales of oil to places such as China and India. Is it the case that Russia, being a nuclear power, can just do as it pleases, or what more can the G7 do? Ken? Have we lost Ken? We do seem to have lost Ken. Kidan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, he's
Yeah?
back.
Okay.
Right.
Yes, Ken, sorry. You're...
Sorry. Yeah, I'm so sorry. My connection is not very good.
Okay. Okay, maybe let's ask.
So yeah, everybody.
Okay, Ken, sorry, we'll have to move on from that one. Kiran, what's your thoughts on this? Obviously, there's a lot of India's getting buying a lot of energy oil from oil from Russia, despite the sanctions from the West. What can the G7 do to try to prevent Russia and really hurt it economically?
Yeah, so India has been receiving oil from Russia. In fact, the quantity in which it has been receiving it has gone up ever since the war against Ukraine was launched. And although India has not explicitly condemned Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, it has time and again highlighted that there should be a ceasefire and this war should not continue. For example, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, when he met President Putin in Samarkand last year on the sidelines of the SCO summit, he highlighted and told him in his face that this is not an era of war. Despite that, when you see that India is receiving a lot of oil from Russia, and it has been increasing every month, so India keeps on saying, and one has to keep in mind the fact that India will always look for its national interest first. So to serve its energy security, to help its people, because it is a big country and might likely have already crossed China as the most populous country in the world. So it has its developmental needs for which it requires energy. And if it is coming easy through Russia, why not? And that's what India has been highlighting while calling on Russia also to stop the war. So what G7 can do is the most advanced countries from the very beginning have been kind of telling India to do something which impacts Russia. But India, as I said, has always said that its national interest comes first, no matter what. And that's why it will continue to do what it is doing right now. And I think G7 can do little in this regard.
Yeah, this could be a sticking point in the talks between Modi and the Western leaders in Hiroshima.
But I think they have kind of come to the terms with the fact that India would not move on this. So right. I'm not sure that they are going to press Prime Minister Modi on this front. In fact, the US recently or a few months ago said also that it doesn't have any problem with India buying oil from Russia, as far as I remember. So I'm not seeing this going to be a sticking point at the talks in Hiroshima this time. I think there would be more other broader issues about which the two sides would be talking, the G7, India, and other countries. And going back to your previous question on what Prime Minister Modi is expecting from the summit in Hiroshima, I would like to again highlight that at the moment, when the G7 appears to be primarily focused on the Ukraine crisis and looks united in taking actions against Russia, India would expect the advanced countries to also consider the developmental priorities of the less developed world. And it would be hoping that the G7 would help shape the discourse on issues of the developing countries, which can later be followed by the G20, whose summit takes place in New Delhi in September. At the same time, India and Japan are global and strategic partners, and New Delhi may be expecting that under Tokyo's leadership of the G7, the two sides as presidents of the leading international bodies this year, namely G20 and G7, give a coordinated response in terms of the global developmental agenda. And developing ties with the global south is also a key pillar of Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's foreign policy, which was reflected in his March visit to India when he personally invited Prime Minister Modi to attend the G7 summit, and also outlined in a speech his vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, for which his country is also separately working with Australia, India, and Japan as part of the quadrilateral security dialogue. And during that speech, he pledged USD 75 billion in infrastructure development support for the strategic region, throwing his weight behind Prime Minister Modi's appeal to back less developed countries of the world. Thank you.
Okay. Should be very, very interesting. Next question, and again, it's anonymous. This is for Lolly. Just quoting the question here. I believe a G12, as Ken mentioned, or any hybrid of G7 will push China and Russia further. Thus, the supply chain problem will become more exacerbated. Do you agree with this statement or disagree with it? And if so, why? To Lolly, please.
Okay, I mean, geopolitics is definitely one of the biggest uncertainties to the supply chain in recent years. And I would like to talk about it from two perspectives. For example, the compliance for export control regulations. I mean, my colleague Annie and I, we know some of the export control lawyers, and they all share with us that their business have never been so good in these years. I mean, because of the US sanction Huawei and so many Chinese companies, and later sanction a lot of Russian entities. These export control lawyers are so busy, and so does the supply chain, the suppliers, because there are so many detailed export control regulations for them to follow and to comply. And this is very difficult and challenging for them. And I remember, maybe it was last year or the year earlier, TSMC even opened a job opening and looking for experts on geopolitics. So you can see how these companies are, highlighted the importance of geopolitics nowadays. And apart from that, last week I attended TSMC's technology symposium in Hsinchu. And on the stage, TSMC CEO C.C. Wei, he shared a small story. He said that when the Ukraine war happened last year, and TSMC, along with other companies, was scrambling to secure the supply of neon gas, which is a crucial specialty gas in the manufacturing process of chip making. And he said, guess what? Eventually, we bought the neon gas like 6 times or 7 times higher than usual price. And this is just one tiny aspect from the impact of a war on the supply chain. So yeah, of course, I think the supply chain disruptions and problems compound with the geopolitical uncertainties are going to be a big challenge for the supply chain going forward.
Yeah, you certainly won't have any dull days covering the tech industry
Yes.
in the current climate. Okay. I think we've got Ken back, I'm pleased to say. So I'm going to combine 2 questions together. One is from Abdul Mumin Zakaria, and one is from Kathy Abising. Questions would be, do you think China will invade Taiwan soon? And to follow up on that, is Japan and other members of the G7, do they have any effective deterrence to prevent or contain a possible invasion of Taiwan by China? Well, I thought Ken was back.
Yes, I am back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm so sorry about this hotel connection. Right. So will China invade Taiwan? I don't think so. I think the only scenario where China will take action is if Taiwan declares independence, at which Xi Jinping and the communist leaders will be cornered into taking action. I think China thinks that the time right now is not right. It's not ready. And they would prefer to do it much more slowly. Step by step, they want to build their military capability so that they will have dominance clearly in the Taiwan Strait, and that they can win without fighting. I think that's the strategy, and I think that right now there are so much more risks than the benefits, and I really don't see the benefits. I think Xi Jinping wants a victory, and that victory is probably not invading and taking over Taiwan at the expense of being considered a pariah in the international community. I think like a customs union with Taiwan, where both sides will integrate the economy and talk of like independence, will be overwhelmed by voices that call for better economic ties. I think that's the strategy.
Okay, thanks, Ken. I think Ken, you could just turn off your camera to improve your connection, possibly.
Right.
How does that work? Okay, thank you. Just following up on Taiwan. So we've got a presidential election there next January. Lawley, obviously some very different people with different policies and different views are running in this race. What do you think the geopolitical impact will be of this next election?
Yeah, I think it's gonna be a lot to monitor for this upcoming presidential election in January, because the ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party (DPP), is more like a China skeptical political party, and the DPP has been sided with the U.S. very closely in the past 7-8 years. And on the other hand, the biggest opposition, Kuomintang KMT, is more labeled as China-friendly party. So the next presidential election will definitely decide in the next 4 years whether Taiwan will change its strategy to stay a little bit away from the US and trying to improve its ties with China again, or to continue its current strategy, which is to stand with the US closely and then maintain not so good relations with China.
Mm-hmm. Yep, well, it'll be something. It'll certainly be keeping us busy as well. That will.
Yes, yes, it's gonna be very busy and a lot to monitor from now on.
A lot to monitor, yeah. Especially now we know all the names of the main.
Yes, yes, yeah. Yes.
Okay, going back to Ken. Back to the Ukraine war is a question from a Mr. Nakanishi. How can G7 member states and partners be united to stop the war in Ukraine? What kind of leadership should Japan be taking on this matter?
Right. So if there was an easy answer, they would have taken it. So there is no easy answer, but there are new developments in the international landscape, and that is what is going to happen in the Turkish elections. Even if both sides win, it'll be a new development. If Kılıçdaroğlu wins, he will have a new blank sheet of paper to start with. But more interestingly, if Erdogan wins again, I think he'll have a huge mandate to play a mediating role. Until now, he was so worried about the election that he couldn't afford to alienate Russia, because Russia has so much economic influence over Turkey in terms of trade and energy and number of tourists. But now that is past. Erdogan really has a free hand to mediate, perhaps with a stronger hand towards Russia. So it is a small window of opportunity, but I think Erdogan's Turkey could be used to try to find a solution in a different something that's different from a few months ago. But I think the G7 has to agree on what outcome, a realistic outcome it wants, because kicking Russia out of all of Ukraine territory will be very difficult for Putin to swallow. Weakening Russia, continuing the war and weakening Russia so much that they can never wage a war again is perhaps what the Pentagon wants, but that sounds a little dangerous, and it doesn't look like it. So there has to be a middle ground while utilizing Erdogan as a mediator. So that would be my answer.
Right. And of course, we'll be watching the this what looks like a spring offensive or summer offensive by the Ukrainians over the next few months. That could be a pivotal factor in this war, but obviously we'll have to see, especially Ukraine now backed with a lot more weaponry from Europe. Going over our next question, that's from Saya Suzuki. Sorry, no, it's not from Saya Suzuki, it's anonymous. Sorry about that. I would like to ask how can Japan ask countries called the Global South and Pacific countries to actively join defending the current world order, given the negative effects of the shocking cancellation of some meetings by the Biden administration? I think this person is referring to his cancellation of the visit to Papua New Guinea after the G7. So Kiran, what do you think?
Thank you, Andy. Before I answer that question, let me also remind you that next year India is holding the general elections, and there are many indicators that Prime Minister Modi is returning to power. So this in a way strengthened the cooperation he's already forging with the countries across the world, and it will further also lead to him developing his rapport with the world leaders in a stronger way. Now, going back to the question you asked, how can Japan ask countries of the so-called Global South and Pacific nations to actively join to defend the current world order despite the cancellations by the Biden administration? So you cannot really force the countries to do what they want to do or what they don't want to do, but at the same time, Japan can call on these countries to help protect the world order, and that can be done in collaboration with India, because the countries of the Global South look up to India to and listen to what India says. So it would be really interesting if Japan request India or can with India together call on these countries to help defend the current world order. And if India says something, obviously these countries would take more interest in following that path. But nothing can be said for sure that it will happen, but at least some initiatives, some efforts can be made by Japan in collaboration with India. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Okay, we have to rush a little bit now because we are running out of time. We've just got a few minutes left. Maybe I'll ask Ken to close this out for us. It's a question from Saya Suzuki. She assumes that because it's held in Hiroshima, Prime Minister Kishida will present the importance of reduction of nuclear weapons. But given the current war situation in Ukraine, etc., how do you think the attending countries will respond to a call for denuclearization from Kishida?
Right. This reminds me of a TV program I saw the other day with Michelle Obama. This is not related to the nuclear issue, but she was being asked, as a woman, can I have my career and can I have a family as well? And she said, well, you can have it all, but you cannot have it all at once. And I think this applies to the nuclear issue too. Kishida wants a world without nuclear weapons, and that can be a goal for the future. But as for today, in this current environment, it is totally unrealistic to call for a world without nuclear weapons. What is important now is to bolster deterrence so that people like Vladimir Putin are not allowed to make threats using his own tactical nuclear weapons. So There is a lot of development this week. Probably a submarine equipped with nuclear weapons will go to South Korea, and that would be a show of America's nuclear power to try to deter North Korea and possibly China. And that would trigger a debate inside Japan. Japan cannot host such a submarine because it has a principle of not possessing nuclear weapons, not producing nuclear weapons, and also not allowing anybody to bring in nuclear weapons to Japanese territory. So this is a very old principle that Japan has maintained for many years. There will be discussion about maybe relaxing the third one to allow Americans to bring in nuclear weapons to bolster deterrence for now. But in the long run, there will be a call for abolishing nuclear weapons. So Kishida could start discussion on relaxing those three non-nuclear principles, but at the same time joining the ban on nuclear weapons as an observer state to make clear that Japan, in the long run, is for the abolishment of nuclear weapons. Sorry for the long answer.
That's okay, Ken. No problem at all. Yeah, I had a very visual reminder of the effects of nuclear weapons this afternoon when I took a trip to the Peace Park and I looked at the atomic bomb dome there, the iconic shell of the building that remained despite the nuclear explosion back in 1945. Okay, on that happy note, going to say thank you very much to my colleagues, Lorly, Ken, and Kiran for your time and for your stimulating thoughts. And also to thank, most of all, is our readers, our subscribers, our listeners, our viewers. Thank you all for tuning in. And I wish you all well. And we hope to bring you some quality coverage of the G7 summit here in Hiroshima. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and bye.
Thank you very much.